Thank you for joining me today. My name is Jarrell. I wanted to discuss some interesting topics today regarding the Switch 2. There's a lot of talk online going around about some potential functionality. Now, the Nintendo Direct for the Switch 2 will be in 2 days from now, and it's going to be very exciting. I believe this will be the moment that Nintendo puts all of the cards on the table, and they will announce a launch date for the Switch 2. So this is going to be very exciting. I believe we're going to find out exactly what that C button does. There's a lot going on in the games industry right now. There's a lot to talk about, but say, for example, there's Ubisoft with their stock price continuing to plummet after the partial buyout from Tencent. But that topic is so boring, and I would honestly rather watch 4 hours of watching paint dry. So instead of discussing those boring topics, I'm going to talk about something very cool. So people have been sort of rumoring, they've been discussing rumors about a potential functionality for the Switch to use, for the Switch 2 to use a Switch 1 as a controller. And this would basically be used as a Wii U mode. And for those that are not familiar, the Wii U was Nintendo's previous game console, which was so absurdly, extremely awesome, but developers unfortunately did not really make the most of the unique potential of that hardware. The Wii U had a controller with a gamepad built in, and the big deal about that is that every game basically already had the functionality built in. It behooved developers to use the screen, even though they didn't have to. It was technically and physically part of every single game that launched on the Wii U. It was really, really fantastic. And if that feature were to return to the Switch 2, it would be really, really wonderful. But I do not really believe it will. I'm going to discuss from a logical standpoint what it would take in terms of logistics to implement this feature. And I'm going to explain from a business and a brand management whether or not this is a good idea. So, is the Wii U mode possible? Also, people are saying there's some way to attach a previous, the Switch 1, attach that to the Switch 2, and have a dual screen mode and handheld mode. So let's go ahead and discuss that. So first, the logistics and the implications of that. So basically, the Switch needs to either have an application or functionality built into the software to put the Switch into controller mode, the Switch 1. So let's say you have your Switch 1, and you enter controller mode. Let's call it gamepad mode, right? So either there's a firmware update and it's built into the software, or you have to open an app. But I think it would be more logical to have a button added to the firmware. Open your Switch 1, enter gamepad mode. On your Switch 2, on a firmware and hardware level, it has to be designed to connect to the Switch 1. It's not something that you can just sort of and ah and then add later because you sort of thought of it. The hardware and the software need to be designed to support that. And that's fundamental, because that means that all of your development environments, your game engines especially, for example, like Unity and Unreal and other engines which are designed for the Switch, all of those absolutely need to have that built in from the ground up. You don't just add something like that in. It's significantly more complicated than that, and also from a business standpoint, it fundamentally needs to be a core part of that product's identity. So, on the Switch 1, you open the gamepad app. On the Switch 2, let's pretend that this is what the C button does. We all know that there's a C button on the Switch 2, so let's press the C button, means connect. You push that, you have your Switch 2, your Switch 1. Now they're connected because you've pressed the connect button, you open the app. So that's it. Basically, you set your Switch 2 into the dock. That is now on docked mode, and you have your Switch 1. You can use that as a controller, and it's basically the exact same setup as the Wii U now. You now have a touchscreen with the gamepad. You have your physical controls. So how this would function is that the Switch 2 would stream audio and video to the Switch. So the Switch 2 is doing all the work. And the reason why this is because your games have to have all of the logic being processed by that piece of hardware. This is how it worked on the Wii U. The gamepad did not do any work. All of the work is being done by the console itself. So the Switch 2 functions as the console, and this means that the Switch 1 does not need any special hardware. It is only audio and video that is being streamed in real time to the Switch. We know this is possible. It's very possible. It was handled very well on the Wii U. The video and audio quality were very good on the Wii U on the gamepad. So that really explains that you don't need to download extra software on your Switch for each individual game. If you did have to download software for each game that used, gamepad mode, that would not be feasible or practical. It would be very confusing for people. It would be a very bad decision, business-wise. So for me personally, behind the scenes, I have been experimenting with using two Switches, using one as a gamepad and the other to use in docked mode, but there is no video and audio streaming, which means that if I were to make a game that uses gamepad mode where I require people to own two Switches, which is already absurd to begin with, as a ridiculous expectation for people to own two Switches, that means your game has to be only optional for all of those modes. And it's such a sloppy implementation because you have to download a second app, and the app is specifically only for the gamepad mode. Try explaining this to people, especially if English is not their first language. They can understand some English, but, they're not going to understand when you try to explain something just esoteric and complicated like this. It's a very bad business decision, which is why I haven't proceeded down that route with any other games. I've been experimenting with the idea, but it's just too sloppy business-wise. So having the Switch 2 do all of the audio and video processing, having that stream to the Switch, this is the approach that is most practical. That's how it was done on the Wii U. It's the easiest for absolutely everyone. All functionality for streaming audio and video is performed on the Switch 2, as well as receiving input controls. All of those things are handled by the game engine. So whether you're using Unity or Unreal or whatever engine, the developers would not have to do extra work. The developers should not have to manually do anything extra for that. The game engine is designed to do all of that, which is why this needs to be a core feature that's designed from the ground up, from the very beginning, in the planning stages of this product. It's not something you just slap on later. So I want to explain why this is very unlikely. And the reason why I believe Nintendo is unlikely to pursue this route is due to fractured hardware requirements. You're basically asking people to own multiple pieces of pretty expensive hardware, honestly. You are asking them to own a Switch 2 and then also a Switch 1 or a Switch Lite or OLED. For people that already own a Switch, this isn't a big deal, but there are a lot of people out there, especially I read your comments, I'm hearing from people that did not own a Switch, that do not intend to own one, but they are interested in picking up a Switch 2. It would be a very bad decision business-wise and in terms of optics to then say, oh, we're making these games that exclusively use the Switch 2 with gamepad mode, so you have to go and spend a few $100s more on some older hardware. That's not smart. That's a terrible idea. So logically, if we follow this route, no game could allowed to be required to use the Switch 1 because these fractured hardware requirements are anti-consumer, honestly. This means that games would need to be designed to work just using the Switch 2, and any potential modes that use the Switch 1 as a controller must be optional, which means the core content of the game must be not without the gamepad mode. Any functionality would then be optional, which negatively impacts the creativity and the uniqueness of games, and it thus defeats the entire purpose of the feature. The whole point of the Wii U was to encourage developers to do something interesting and exciting and to take creative risks, and it didn't really happen that much, which is a real bummer. So the cost for this sort of function would be high in terms of development and implementation on Nintendo's side. The cost is high. Any business decision you take, you must do a cost to risk analysis or cost to benefit analysis. So for this, the benefit would be you get to have Wii U ports, and that's about it, because it is unlikely that developers will make full use of this functionality, because we didn't see it on the Wii U, but we had way less small studios and independent studios back then. These days we have significantly more independent studios, so we are far more likely to see developers take creative risks and make better use of this, but I do not believe that's enough. We really need AAA developers and large studios with the heavy hitters that are able to take those sort of risks, and we know that the AAA studio is absolutely averse to risk. They are averse to creativity, and the AAA space right now is at the lowest point it's ever been in terms of creativity and integrity. So that's a real shame, but don't worry, we'll see what we can do to fix that up. The risk here is that developers won't use the gamepad mode for anything meaningful due to the fractured hardware requirements. And another risk is that people will get confused and they'll start to view the Nintendo brand as esoteric and too complicated. As a result, people may be more likely to turn to Nintendo's competitors like Sony and Microsoft for business, for their gaming. So that would be bad, but that is the logical route that you would follow from a business standpoint. So this sort of off-screen streaming, the gamepad mode, would be a very niche feature. I personally would love it. This is my dream feature. If Nintendo did implement a gamepad mode, all of my games would use it, and I would hit the nitrous switch and I'd be making games double time, and I'd be making a bunch of really interesting, cool stuff that use the off-screen gamepad mode. That's how I personally feel. I would love this feature, but I just don't see it likely. As a business decision, it has a high cost, very high risk, very low reward. Secondly, we've been seeing rumors going online and people discussing attaching a mount to a Switch, and we'll show some pictures on the screen now. So I'll go ahead and bring that up. Sorry, I'm just was listening to some Swedish yodeling music. So here's what people are sort of looking at, and I've seen people talking about this recently. These sort of attach a screen to the Switch 2. They're talking about these patents. So we'll take a look at this one here. I've seen people sort of discussing this. So what's the point of this? This would basically allow for DS and 3DS emulation, which would be, it would be big. That would be massive. Access to the DS library would be incredible. Access to the 3DS library would be just a massive, massive victory for Nintendo. It would bring in a significant amount of people, especially people that really still enjoy playing 3DS, that really still enjoy playing DS. This would be a brilliant idea. It would be a great business decision. Now, Nintendo likely wouldn't do this because I don't know. It's a very good idea. I'm sort of analyzing this, and this is something that I think this is something that they potentially would do, and I believe it's something that they should do. Even if the attachment was something that you purchased for $100, and it was just a screen that had a magnetic mechanism or attached to the USB port, which we know is on top of the Switch. There is a USB-C port on top of the Switch. This screen plugs in, it draws power from the USB port, it latches on through the power of magnetism. It's not just for mutants. And you are able to play 3DS. You buy that attachment. So not everyone wants to use this to play DS and 3DS, and that's fine. For the people that do want to use their Switch 2 for DS and 3DS, they could potentially purchase a second screen, and they can attach it on there. And even if Nintendo only had access to their IP for DS and 3DS, they have access to many titles. They could reach out to third-party developers, and they can organize making those games available via a virtual console or a porting system of some kind. That would be brilliant. It would be really wonderful. This is what I would really like to see this. This would be fantastic. I would personally like to see this very much. So that's what I wanted to discuss today. This is something that would be a significantly more feasible decision. There's much less risk in terms of the developmental cost. This is significantly easier to understand than grabbing your Switch or making someone buy a Switch and then connect it to their Switch 2 in an esoteric way. This does not have the same risks and the barrier of entry. This is something that I think could be on the table. I would love to see this. I'd love to see it. So that's it. So that's all I wanted to discuss today. I'm working very hard here. I have my commercial titles that I'm finishing up, but I've also been working on a homebrew game for the PSP. I will be launching that within the next day or two. So please keep an eye out for that. And I've been writing a lot of music for my upcoming games, especially, specifically my Silver Falls games. So I'll play something on the piano for you now. This is the music that I have been working on this past week. In the game, you will hear a full band instrumental version, but I'll just play it on the piano. But when you hear it, it's going to be like a 70s, 80s rock ballad. So, okay, thanks very much for watching the video. Here's some piano music.